Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your pushback, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the incredible coincidence about how there's electricity power blackouts all across the Western world at the same time. Isn't that incredible? Wow. I mean, how can that happen? Um, each of the countries that's having a blackout has radically different situations in terms of electricity generation economics. I'll use Australia as an example. Now, there's been power blackouts in Queensland, which is sort of the northeast of Australia, and in New South Wales, which is called Central East Australia, and elsewhere around the place. And the electricity authorities and even the government has been asking or pleading with users, factories, to say, well, can you shut down your factory for today to save on the power? And there have been lunatic things coming from politicians saying, well, the real reason there's a power shortage is because of swimming pool pumps. I mean, what a fucking joke. But clearly, all the countries of the world, the Western countries at least, following the globalist controlled and directed model of moving from coal as an energy source, for example, to wind and solar and any alternative energy, because the investment that the globalist elites have in alternative energy is massive, and they're getting huge government subsidies, and they stand to make a financially an absolute killing on this. So, I mean, without subsidies and handouts and government grants, the alternative energy sector wouldn't be even minimally viable, even zero viable, or 1% viable. So, and clearly this is globalist directed and orchestrated and centrally scripted. The United Nations, World Economic Forum, they bang on endlessly propaganda about climate change and so on. But the economics vary. Some countries, for example, have no coal or no gas, and so because they have to import all their coal and gas and oil, because they import it all, then looking at alternative energy on a relative basis is cheaper for them because they have to import it all. Now, in the case of Australia has abundant reserves. It's estimated Australia has enough coal to supply the entire world for the next 200 years. I mean, that's how much coal Australia has. A lot of that coal is very high quality, not the brown coal, but the good high quality black coal. And this coal on a relative basis is quite close to the surface. So the cost of extracting it is relatively small as well, or relatively low rather. And I say relative because in other countries, like in somewhere parts of Western Europe, they've still got coal reserves that they can potentially at least dig out. But it's so far now below the surface and so close to towns and villages and so on that the cost of extracting it is monumental. So again, if you either don't have coal, for example, coal, or the cost of extracting is very high, then the relative benefit in terms of cost benefit of alternative energy then increases because the other options are so expensive. But in the case of Australia and some other countries too, the access to cheap energy, not just coal, but gas and also quite a lot of the lighter oils can be got out in Australia relatively cheaply, particularly the coal and the gas. So Australia, the cost of alternative energy is very high in Australia, given how cheap the coal and the gas are here in Australia. Not only are they good quality, but they're fairly cheap to extract. And again, relatively cheap to extract. But because they're so cheap, alternative energy must receive massive subsidies in order to shape up against on the cost benefit of the fossil fuels. Now, one day, and that day could be 10, 15, 20, 25 years in the future, one day technology will allow alternative energy to be a reliable source of energy, as reliable as coal-fired power stations. But that day is still quite some time off. So in Australia's case, Australia is making its business pay more, making its citizens pay a lot more than they need to, because there is so much abundant resources here in Australia, that it's absurd. Now, it's different in Western Europe, Germany, France, for example, where the cost of extracting coal and so on is compared to Australia, at least, very much higher. So solar and wind sort of stack up economically, given that high cost. But this is sort of economics that each country should do based on their natural resources and the cost of accessing things like coal. So the world has thousands of years worth of coal in the ground. So this idea we're about to run out and this sort of thing is just nonsense. It's an absolute outrageous lie. But the third world countries are busily building electrical generation, coal-fired power generation stations, and the globalists are trying to force the West to go alternative energy when it economically doesn't stack up, or is imposing a very big cost. Now, Australian citizens are paying, because of the green mania, it's again globalist controlled and directed and orchestrated and scripted, are paying a very high price for electricity in this country, 3 times higher than it needs to be, given the availability of I mentioned earlier, coal and gas. So countries that have abundant energy resources are being forced to pay effectively a world price for oil and for energy, and which is disproportionately affecting those countries, Australia being among them. In countries that have very little energy available, then the cost of going to alternatives, wind and solar, is in proportion less because of that equation. Now, I just want to come back to the activism, or come rather to the activism that's going on and has gone on for a while in the climate change arena. Now, whether the facts are accurate or not, we can debate. But one thing that isn't in dispute is that children from a young age are subject to a withering campaign that is internationally coordinated, scripted, directed, and pushed on children from a young age right through college and into work. And given the, you cannot find, particularly young girls, you cannot find young women and girls who have not been working for an NGO. And the dumber they are, the more likely that they work for the NGO. But this means that from, say, primary school, let's say from 5 years old, right through to, say, 21, 22 years old, then including a year or two for NGOs, a lot of Western children, again, particularly the girls, have been subject to 19 or 20 years of endless climate change propaganda. The world's going to end. The world's going to, that's it. You have to do something, and you're going to push back against the man. You get out there and wave placards, and you know who's doing, who's creating all this bad, but they're putting this noxious fumes in the air. It's damn white fucking fascist Nazis, Hitler. And so when you're fighting back against this global warming, it's going to kill us all any day now. You're not just stopping the destruction of the planet, but you're fighting back against Hitler. And so you can be doubly virtuous every time you wave a placard or scream, some abuse at a straight white male, because they're the ones that are doing it. But you little moron, stupid little girl, you're fighting back. You're showing those evil straight white Hitlers the error of their ways and showing them what they must do. So they've been subject to this crazy propaganda for a long, long time, and they believe it it's as true as night follows day, and so they don't bother with. It's a religion in terms of its zealotry. They don't bother with the facts and the figures and the reality and so on. They just live in this fantasy world. And this means that there's a huge I don't know what you call it, a huge pool of Western citizens that are moving into their mid-20s and older, who are fervently of the view that climate change is something that they may have a useless, pointless life, being a part-time barista or something like that, and they can look forward to a future of absolute nothingness. But fuck, their life is worthwhile. They are really doing something to save the planet, to really, really save the human race. And let's have a little cry out there. And most of all, they're stopping Hitler. And this gives their meaningless lives, I guess, some meaning. But it's kind of sad that there's a brainwashed, there's that many millions of kids, again, particularly young girls, brainwashed into this nonsense. Now, again, the technology is going to come along one day, and I don't think it'll be that far away, actually. But until that time, why should Western citizens pay a lot more than they need to? Why should Western industry become uncompetitive? And why should we be paying more for goods and services than we need to for something that doesn't really work, that's causing blackouts that we're seeing now, and that it's being centrally controlled by a globalist elite that don't give a flying fuck about us, while they travel around in private jets and generate carbon footprints that would dwarf small villages. So that's something to think about. But when you realise that all these blackouts are occurring at the same time across the Western world, whether it be in Sydney or London or parts of the United States and Brisbane in Australia and so on, then you realise just how centrally scripted and coordinated and directed by the globalists this whole fucking scam is. You've been with Tacitus State, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.